Wow.
Got it. Thank you.
I just turned off my phone in case anybody else needs a reminder.
There were none.
Simmons, I'd like to welcome you to Providence Public Library. I'm Louise Moulton. I do programs and I manage the programs and exhibits here at the library. And the dream of time travel has fascinated humans for centuries. Facing the future, it engenders both hope and fear about our imagined outcomes. Facing the past, it provokes curiosity towards people who lived and thought in ways that are now seen very different. Our Portals exhibit and program series is made possible through funding support from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities and Nordstrom, and in partnership with the Providence Athenaeum, the John Hay Library, the Rhode Island Historical Society, Cable Car Cinema, and RISD, among others. Major funding for free programming here at the library is through the Providence Public Library, a private nonprofit, and through supporters like you. So welcome tonight. Our Portals program, where we learn about Rhode Island's past with an opportunity to reconnect with the events surrounding the burning of Providence on this, the actual eve of an event that occurred 340 years ago. And tonight, perhaps we'll contemplate the impact of that event on today and future tomorrows. Bill Simmons graduated from Brown University in 1960 and earned his PhD in anthropology at Harvard University in 1967. For many years, he was a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. Fortunately for us, in 1998, he moved to Brown University as his executive vice president and provost and is currently chair of the anthropology department. He is also vice chair of the board of trustees of the Providence Public Library, and we welcome Bill to the library.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for coming. I've been told that my voice can be very soft, and if you can't hear me in the back row, raise your hand. And if I see two hands raised, I'll use the microphone. First, I want to say just a word about Providence. As places go, I think, places vary in terms of the degree to which they're interesting, the degree to which they're underpinned by tunnels. They have legends, they have stories. They have fiction writers that are quite interested in local history and so forth. And Providence is certainly one of those places. I think a stranger coming into Providence would see the statue of Roger Williams, for example, standing there at Prospect Park with his arm up, reaching out over the city, and then looking at a map of the city and find out that all of the geographical boundaries there and waterways and many of the hills all have Narragansett Indian names. I mean, where can you find a circumstance of that sort? Where the founding colonist of the colony, Roger Williams, the Protestants didn't have saint, so to speak, but I think that Roger Williams is as close to sainthood as you could get within, say, the Baptist congregational sort of tradition of Christianity. So he figures into this story, and so that's why I'm saying a few words about the way in which the presence of Roger Williams is still a very important part of Providence, as is the presence of the Native Americans who lived here and still live here, the Narragansett Indians of Rhode Island. I'll also say that the world has yet to figure out, and the world has been very slow, I think, to understand the ways in which as societies expand, as populations expand, as populations migrate, as empires expand, as conquests take place, all of those things that happened in the world in the past and are still happening in the world today, no one really has a clear idea, or very few, I think there are very few clear ideas as to how it is that those people who are colonized, overrun, in some sense diminished in this process, can find a place for themselves in this world that is overpowering them. And I think that Providence and Rhode Island was no exception to this idea that no one really has a good idea as to how to do that. How do you do colonialism at the same time do it in some way that takes account of the people you're colonizing? That's a very big question. But I will also say that Roger Williams was a pioneer in that area, and I think that what came out of that in terms of the culture of Rhode Island and its traditions, the values that it holds to itself, I think that in the hierarchy of people who didn't have a clue as to how to colonize, Rhode Island was somewhere high in that chart, hard in that, sort of like ranking of people that had something like a clue. Not saying they had the perfect answer to things, but I think they had some interesting ideas. I want to say a word about portals. Also, portals mean many things. They mean doorways, for example. In fact, that's the most common sort of association with the word. But they also mean bottlenecks. They mean points of transition. They mean passages of different kinds. So that in folklore, in ritual, in mythology, and so forth, people speak of portals in terms of passing through a certain point in the life cycle. They think of portals as passing from life to death or to the afterworld. Portals have all kinds of meanings in terms of how we understand them. One of the common meanings one of the common ways in which the idea of portals shows up in folklore and mythology is in terms of death and rebirth. And so that what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a form of portal to be understood in that sense, the sense of death and rebirth. Because on March 29th, 1676, the colony of Providence was close to death. I mean, that was, well, and I'll get back into what I mean by that, as we go along. But they came about as close as any community could become to not existing at all. And then something changed, and portals also involve a past that is now past. That is something that's left behind. And they also involve a new world and a new mentality and a new landscape into which you're moving, where things have radically changed. And so what happened at Providence in the spring of 1676 can be seen in that framework. And in many ways it shaped the Rhode Island, it shaped the Providence, and it definitely shaped the larger Rhode Island that we know today, and a lot of that goes back to events of this early time period. So the English, as we know, arrived here in 1636, and Rhode Island was Roger Williams was a refugee from Massachusetts, and he came to Rhode Island because of his Baptist beliefs, or at least for the fact that he didn't really find that there was biblical underpinning to the authoritarian interpretation of Christianity that he found in Massachusetts Bay. He determined that there are other ways of looking at the Bible, and he also had other ideas about how biblical messages had been interrupted as they were translated and as they passed through history. So in other words, he was an educated intellectual. He understood many, many languages. He really took the things people thought about then very, very seriously. And this was a world that is like the one we live in today. I mean, in a sense, the Puritans and those 17th century English people here were in many ways more like the Native Americans than they are like us, in the sense that they had beliefs in such ideas, for example, as providence. They had beliefs in such ideas as witchcraft. They had beliefs in all kinds of things, magical, beliefs in remedies and all kinds of things that we would look at today and say, well, that's just, superstition and so forth. So this is a different world that we're looking at here. But in any event, Roger Williams came in 1636. He found, if you know the story, it's almost like a Native American creation story, many of which begin with 2 or 3 guys in a boat who are out there on the, where the world has been flooded and the boat is looking for a place to land, and then they land and they get out, and then they populate the place and they become the human race and so forth. Well, Roger Williams began Providence, a bunch of people, a bunch of guys in a boat. They came across the Seekonk River and they came to this part of Providence and so forth. They found a spring where they settled and so forth, and they thought that was providential, and so they named the place for that. So one of the things that distinguished this colony from others was that, and this is a very interesting one, when the world was originally divided up in 1493 by the King and Queen of Spain and by the Pope, everything east of a line from the North Pole to the South Pole was to belong to Portugal. Everything to the west of that line was to belong to Spain. And so by the time anyone, without Native Americans knowing it, their entire continent was already the real estate had been taken over and legalized with all kinds of official seals and so forth, and others had the deed to their property. And the same thing happened in a different way in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That is, there's English settled and they did it under the warrant of King Charles II, King Charles I, sorry. So it was by, a divine king's authority that they were believed to have the right to own the land. Well, Roger Williams, when he arrived in Providence, was told that you don't have a patent, you don't have a warrant, you don't have a charter, you don't have any of these things. And Roger Williams made the point, well, what makes you think because the king wrote your warrant that has any basis in reality? Where in the Bible, for example, can you find anything that justifies that? These are the people who own the land. And so he was he was ahead of his time in that sense, with the idea that the Native Americans actually owned the place, and that if he was to live there, it would be as their guest and also as their customer, in a sense, as a person who had compensated for the property that was transferred to him, that was given to him. That is, he did it as an economic exchange, and he did it, voluntarily and all of that. So that was the step, at least in a more progressive, I guess you could say, direction. But nevertheless, as I say, the idea of how to do colonizing has never been very well, worked out. And so by 1675 or so, things had really reached a point of no return. The English were claiming that people be tried in their courts and so forth, and the Native Americans had 12,000 years of sovereignty and so forth. And so clearly, at some point in time, this was going to break down, and it did in 1675, and that was King Philip's War. So it began in the East Bay in places like Tiverton, Little Compton, Swansea, Rehoboth, and that general area, and Seekonk and so forth. And it spread, began to spread because as the Wampanoag were then forced to retreat from their own country, they moved out farther into Massachusetts and elsewhere, where they began to ignite all kinds of other local groups that had similar grievances. So within a matter of months, the whole relationship between English and Native Americans had just changed and exploded, in the sense that the Native Americans had realized that they had shared grievances, and they also felt that they might have the opportunity, since they were numerous enough still, that they might be able to win this war. And so the way that it began to develop, they were proven right, at least at the beginning. And in parts of western Massachusetts and elsewhere, northern Connecticut, although Wampanoag were driven out of their own homeland, they ignited other groups elsewhere. So this warfare became very widespread. And the English were unskilled and incapable of fighting this kind of warfare. The English, as you know, in the 17th century, in the English Civil War, they had columns of people who would line up and they would march towards each other, and they'd have pikes and things like that. And you couldn't do that here. You line up in the woods with your pikes and so forth, and have no mobility and so forth. It's not the way that Native Americans fought. So anyway, they had a very hard time adapting to that. But one of the ways in which the English tried to secure an advantage in this was by either making allies with certain Native American groups, because even between them, this is one of the old problems with one of the old strategies of colonialism, that the people who were colonized may have quarrels with one another, and you can use those quarrels to build continued alliances and so on. But also, for those who are neutral, you have to be wary, because they don't know which way they're going to go. And so there's plenty of reason for thinking that the Narragansett of Rhode Island, who were neutral at that time, along with the Niantic, there was plenty of reason for thinking that they were neutral, at least that's what they were claiming, but the English also felt that there was they were beginning to think that there may be some reasons that if the Narragansetts were to commit themselves, there being the largest tribe in this area, that would really tip the balance in this struggle. And so they decided that then they were going to force the Narragansett to make a treaty that would require them to turn over their arms, but also to turn over any of the refugees that were now coming into their country, into Rhode Island, as a consequence of this warfare. And the Narragansetts refused to do that. And so the colonies, United Colonies, not Rhode Island, but the others, the United Puritan Colonies, Rhode Island was not a Puritan colony, declared war on the Narragansett, and they were destroyed. They were forced to abandon their own country at the Great Swamp Fight on December 19th, 1675. So the consequence was the Narragansett were very, very severely damaged militarily, and they had to flee their own country. Where did they flee? Well, they fled out into western Massachusetts, northern Massachusetts. So that whole area from roughly the frontier of now what is now Maine to Plymouth, north to south, and from Hadley, Massachusetts, down to New Haven from north to south, all of that area was at war. And the Narragansett fanned out through that. They organized themselves and allied with other tribes, the Nipmucks, for example, and various others. And they were quite effective in terms of forcing back the English frontier. They were burning down villages, they were burning down houses, they were burning down garrison houses, and so forth. And so it got to the point where western Massachusetts, it was beginning to contract. And the Puritans were actually considering building a wall. I forget exactly from where to where, but somebody thought of it back then. They were going to build a wall of cedar posts across a big part of Massachusetts, 8 foot high, and that was going to be part of the solution. But in any event, I don't think the wall ever got built. But nevertheless, the military encounters were really becoming quite one-sided. And they were also coming closer. They were coming back to the territory where they originated. That is, back to Massachusetts, the southern Massachusetts, to Rhode Island, and parts of Connecticut. They were coming back into this region. As they were becoming more successful, they would also get more hopeful that once they got here, they could, come back and even occupy their old home territories. So in February and March of 1676 was a very bad time from the English point of view, because they were losing many of these struggles. And at about that time, for example, Lancaster, Massachusetts, I believe it was, where Mary Rawlinson was captured, and Medfield, Massachusetts, and other such places, they were burned and destroyed, and the people had to flee and so forth. And then the next thing we know is that a military contingent of 65 English soldiers from Plymouth Colony, which included at that time Seekonk, East Providence, and Rehoboth. So anyway, 65 English from that part of Plymouth, from all of Plymouth, along with 20 Native Americans from Cape Cod, had heard that there was a large party of Narragansetts and others that was beginning to aggregate in the northern part of this, that is in Massachusetts, in the northern part above Rhode Island. So they had reason to believe that there was a very large number of Native Americans who were coming here to wage war back at this old frontier that they had originally left behind. 65 English from Plymouth and 20 Native Americans from Cape Cod marched out along to the eastern bank of the Seekonk River, to Blackstone River, in that general vicinity. And they did, in fact, cite a small party of Narragansett. They described them as Narragansett. And so they attacked this small party, and this is on, I think it was March 25th. They attacked this party of Narragansett, but then, darkness and so forth, but they left with the impression that they had killed many and they lost none of their own. So they were feeling emboldened. So the next day, they returned to the site of the original skirmish, and they saw a group of Narragansett limping into the forest. And 6 or 8 Narragansett limping into the forest, and they thought, well, there they are, let's go get them. So these 65 English and 20 Cape Indians dashed along the Blackstone River towards where these Native Americans were running off, trying to run off in the woods and appearingly hampered in doing so. And the next thing they knew, they were surrounded by about 500 people. And then that 500 people was then backed up by another 400 people. So these 65 English were completely annihilated. The commander's, the officer's name was Michael Pierce, and so it's called Pierce's fight. They call it Pierce's fight. That's how it was recorded. Most of the English were killed. About half of the Indians were killed, and so 45, I think, or so of that English were buried on the site, and 10 of the 10 Native Americans were buried on the site. And that site is still there. It's still marked by a Pierce Memorial. It's in It's in Central Falls, and you can go there to see them back of factories and so forth. The whole 19th and 20th century is kind of like, invaded that area. But anyway, nevertheless, the memorial is there. And the Narragansett then took 9 other English captives and tortured them later that same day. And all of this was now on March 26th. And so those 9 are buried at a place called Nine Men's Misery, which is in Cumberland. So you can still see that monument there today. The site, you can still go there to visit it. So this is getting very close to Providence. So the people in Providence were becoming anxious because they were, at that point, there were probably a population of maybe 500 people here, and there was something like 120 houses. But 500 people is what? How many might have fighting men? Probably less than 100. In any event, they were getting worried, so they sent a message to Governor Clark in Newport. It was the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, saying that they needed help. And basically the governor of Newport said that if you're foolish enough to stay there, we're not so foolish. They didn't say it in exactly those words, but what the message was: if you're foolish enough to stay there, we're not foolish enough to give you arms and materials that will be captured once you're killed, and that will then support the enemy. So what they did say was that we won't help you in terms of any kind of military support, but what we will do for you is that we'll provide sanctuary for those people who want to leave Providence. And we advise all of you to leave, because those of you who then choose to stay have the mental deficiency to want to stay. Then you realize that once you're dead and gone, that they're going to have all of your armaments, they're going to have all the food you've got stored, they're going to have all your ammunition, they're going to have everything. And that's going to be used against us. So at that point, most of the population of Providence cleared out and went to Newport. And what they were promised was that if they needed land, they could have land. And if they needed a cow, they could each family could have a cow. And so many of them actually moved to Newport, and when the war was over, stayed there. So Providence was hugely depopulated at that point, but some of it did come back. But nevertheless, so this brings us, okay, so then the next thing, Rehoboth was attacked. And that was on March 27th, I think, March 28th. March 28th. Who said that? March 28th. Rehoboth was attacked. And burned. And so this is getting closer to home. And then on March 29th, Roger Williams notes in a letter that he wrote that as they looked out over the landscape in the morning, they could see smoke everywhere across Providence. That is out there. There were people living in the woods. Providence had settled as far as Newton Hill. In fact, there were 2 or 3 houses right on Newton Hill at that point that were burned. So all of those who lived out, far out, who didn't come in either to the sanctuary of the forts that had been built on the town street where Providence is now along North Main Street and South Main Street. Those who didn't come into the town and take up residence, and I think they had 7 fortified houses, something like that, didn't take up residence in one of these fortified houses, was at great risk of being killed, and some were. There was one gentleman who felt that as long as he held the Bible and stood in his house that he'd be protected. And so Native Americans sort of thought that was pretty unlike, anyway, they weren't frightened away by that. And so he was one of those who was killed, and another woman who basically is one of those things that I forgot one more thing and went running back to get it. But anyway, so it went. So that 27 to 30, I'm not sure exactly, I don't think anybody knows exactly how many men were left in Providence, but it was something like 27 to 30 in any event. They were armed, and some of them actually had military training, but not very many. So the firing was getting closer, and the houses that had then been abandoned on Town Street along the river, the houses with no one in them, those were being burned. And the total figure at the end of all of this, there's something like 120 houses, and these numbers are not accurate by any means, but one figure is that 30 houses were totally burned, and another figure is that of this 120, only 20 weren't damaged at all. So in other words, 100 of those 120 houses had been damaged or completely burned, completely destroyed. And of course the fortified houses survived and so forth. But what makes this incident interesting, and it's what I want to come to next, is that Roger Williams did have this long history of relationship with the Narragansett, and he traded with them, and they visited him, and his house was always open to him, and Providence itself was open to their coming through and trading and so on. They had worked out a workable relationship. They had no particular religious pressures that they put on. There was no requirement to convert and all the rest of that. It was a somewhat different social system. And when the actual attack against the Narragansett had taken place back in December, Rhode Island did not participate in it, that is, did not contribute. Soldiers did not fight in it. They stood back. They allowed the United Colonies to go through their territory. They even provided transportation for some of them to cross Mount Hope Bay and so forth. But they nevertheless made a decision not to fight, which they didn't. And so they had a little bit of capital, I guess you could say, a little bit of capital. But at that point, the capital had been spent because, as far as the Narragansett were concerned, capital in the sense of credit, I guess, or something like that. As far as the Native Americans were concerned, they had betrayed them by participating passively in the attack on the Narragansett, and that was their position. So, 3 people in Providence spoke the Narragansett language. One was Valentine Whitman, one was Roger Williams, and the other was Captain Arthur Fenner. And Captain Arthur Fenner was the one who was in charge of the Providence garrison. I think he was probably the only one there who actually had military training. He was a former member of the New Model Army, so he knew a lot of things. So amidst all these firings, houses going up in flame, a Native American called out, and he asked for Valentine Whitman, to come out and talk with him. And so Whitman thought that he would do that. And so he started to walk out, and then Roger Williams heard that Whitman was going to do that. And so he called him back, because he said that they had seen that between where the person was who was calling them to come out and talk and where they were, there were a whole bunch of people hidden in a house that was destroyed. And so they called Whitman back. And so then the Narragansett made some promises about that it's okay, we won't do anything. And So he, and Fenner looked the whole thing over and he just said, I'm not going to do that. He didn't think that was a good idea. But Roger Williams but then Whitman was called back, and his family or brother or somebody, said, don't do it, don't do it. So anyway, Roger Williams just said, well, I felt I had to do this on my own. So this is, the only way I can communicate this to you is to actually read some of the sentences out of it. He wrote a letter in which he described this. And this is really unprecedented. It's really one of the most amazing things. There's a long story that goes with the letter, but I'm not going to get into that. So they met without arms. That is, Williams walked out. I asked them who they were. They said Narragansetts, Coesettes, Wampanoag, Nipmucks, and Quanticoos. I asked, for we heard so, whether King Philip, was amongst them. They said no. I asked whither he was, and they said not in these parts. I asked where he was. They said in Connecticut. I asked the where the Narragansett stations were. He said they were at their homes at Narragansett. So he had moved back at this point and at least temporarily reoccupied their own country. I asked who commanded here. They said many captains and inferior sachems and counselors. I asked the names of those present, so they gave me the names and so forth. And they said, I asked the names of those present, that is of the leaders. They said Waswamog, commonly called Wisamog, who then spoke aloud and said, I am Wisamog, what cheer? Now what city rather, has that sentence as its motto? I mean, it's the most amazing thing. Those are words that came out of the mouth of the Native Americans who were standing there, presumably as the story goes, on the Slate Rock when Roger Williams and his boat full of refugees landed here. That was the opening line, what cheer? It was the greeting. They had learned some English, but yet it was what cheer Nitop, and they had also included the Narragansett word along with it. And so he greets them, he says, what cheer? Now this is what's interesting. He said that where they were standing at this point was down right in back of the Roger Williams Memorial. And where the group had aggregated was along the side of the hill, as far as I can figure out, by where the State House is. So that's where they were, and plus others who were coming down below. But the large body of them was up there along that hilltop. He says, this is my ground which you have got from me. A fascinating sentence. The whole mythology of Providence was that this had all been done agreeably by treaty. What he meant by got, when I read that, I thought to myself, what is he saying? Is this a grievance about land, or is he just reminding Roger Williams of who he was? But there's no way to answer that question. Then said another named Powhatan, the Queen's counselor. I am Powhatan and Suckamog, Captain Fenner's great friend. I asked if they were company so in other words, Captain Fenner, who also spoke the language, this other Suckamog wanted him to come out and talk. I asked if they were the company that burned Rehoboth and Swansea, since they owned it, that their number was about 1,500. There are two estimates of how many people there were there. One was 1,000 and the other was 1,500, but I think you can assume from that it was a very large group. I asked them whither they were bound. They said to the towns about Plymouth. They said they would stay about 2 days more with us. By with us, they meant, continuing burning and everything that they were doing. They would stay about 2 more days with us, which they did not, but went away yesterday afternoon, the day after their coming. So this is interesting. At this point they talked, but they after this they left. But back with the talks. I asked them why they assaulted us with burning and killing whoever were kind neighbors to them, and looking back, said, I, this house of mine now burning before my eyes, Roger Williams' house was burning right there, it was case in point, burning has lodged kindly thousands of you these 10 years. They answered that we were their enemies, joined with Massachusetts and Plymouth, entertaining, assisting, and guiding of them. And I said we entertained all Indians, being a thoroughfare town, but neither we nor this colony had acted hostility against them. I told them they were all this while killing and burning themselves. They had forgot where they were by killing and burning, they forgot they were mankind and ran about the country like wolves, tearing down and devouring innocent people, etc., etc. So then he goes on to say, after an exchange of unbelievable exchange, but they were arguing about whether if they had 100 of their warriors against 100 of the Providence soldiers, of which they only had 27, and pitted the two of them against each other. They would decide the contest by seeing who won it that way, but they decided not to do that. I told them, they knew many times I had quenched fires between them and the Bay Colony in Plymouth and Connecticut with them. And then he went on to say that he felt he could do that again. He felt it wasn't too late, that they could come to terms and they could resolve this, and he was hoping that they would trust him to give them the time to do that, the opportunity to do that. So apparently there was quarreling and disagreement. It wasn't as if this was a group with one leader. It wasn't like that. It was a group with many leaders. And the people who were burning weren't necessarily, the ones who weren't burning in this circumstance, were people coming from different constituencies. But they had no control over the whole thing. So anyway, there was no agreement that they would try to engage Williams to somehow put an end to it, even though they felt that some of them felt that would be desirable. And so that's sort of where it ended. And so the next day, rather than to finish the job that they had come there to do, they just left. The entire group had left. And there's no explanation as to why. You'd have to be there to understand from the Native American point of view what it was that happened, but they made the decision to leave. Whether it was because Roger Williams had some cultural capital, who knows what it was, but that's how it happened. So, so in that sense, Providence was near death, and it would not have taken much to have taken that extra day and destroyed the defenses of 27 men. That would not have been an impossible or not have been a difficult thing to do. But nevertheless, they left, and that's that. And then within a few months, the war itself ended. But that was the peak of Indian power at that point. Following that, they began to weaken, a consequence of disease, a consequence of demoralization of various kinds, a consequence of bad omens as interpreted by the shamans, by their powwows, a variety of things. But also by that time, the English had begun to discover some of the ways in which warfare had to be reconfigured and rethought and strategized in this new world. And they had figured out better how to defend themselves and how to attack and how to use mounted soldiers and cavalry and so forth. And so anyway, the war began to wind down. The native people went more and more on the retreat. More and more were surrendering. They were releasing their captives. There were many, many captives taken by the Native Americans during this fighting, and they were hauled off around the different countryside with them as they were wandering around, fighting. They began releasing captives, and the symbolic end of the war came when Philip himself was killed at Mount Hope, where he had retreated, where he thought he was in hiding but wasn't, because he was exposed by some people who had seen him. And then the capture of Anawan, and Anawan's rock over there in Rehoboth, the capture of Anawan. That was basically the end of the war. So following that, then the Narragansett, for a period of several, following that immediately, any of the Narragansett who were involved in the fighting were either executed right away, or some were sold into slavery and sent to places like Bermuda and various other places in the West Indies. And those non-combatants women and children and males that may not have been involved in the fight, known to have not been involved in the fighting, they survived. What the government, what the colony did was they created a reservation, I guess that's the best word for it, in Charlestown. And they put the Narragansett royal family in charge of that. They gave them a certain degree of territory and sovereignty with their own leadership, that is, with their own sachems. And those other native peoples that had been taken in and forced as indentured servants for terms of years here locally in Providence and Cranston and all over the place, but the Native Americans all over this area, in addition to those that were withdrawn into the reservation in southern Rhode Island. And that population continued to have a presence here. You know, it continued to have a presence, does have a presence even into the 20th century. The largest place where they tended to be concentrated was on the other side of Mashpach Pond, where all of the industrial district is now, and there's some kind of a little league park and a whole bunch of other things over there. But that whole area was a neighborhood up until sometime in the 1950s, and a lot of those people were people of Narragansett descent. But in Johnston and other parts of Rhode Island, Native American families, Warwick, that we hear just as a consequence of having been from families that had been Native American families that had been indentured to or employed by colonial families, sometimes over generations. So now we have Roger Williams then presiding. Roger Williams wasn't actually deified, if that's the word, I guess. It wasn't held in reverence during the time that he lived, and even for a number of years since. It's interesting that his mystique, that the degree to which he's venerated has grown over time. And part of that is that I think that some of his ideas, that freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, that church and state should be separate, the idea that the indigenous peoples were the proper owners of the land, and various other things became part of the, what would you call it, the moral DNA of the wider community. That is, as Rhode Island, and in Providence in particular, diversified in the 19th century. This is the peak of the ascent of Roger Williams as an important figure in terms of Rhode Island, lore. That middle to the latter part of the 19th century, a period of great immigration and so forth, he provided a rubric whereby you could see diversity and so forth in a way that religious diversity, that is, in a way that was hospitable and reasonable for people who weren't all coming from the same background. And his thinking on that was that who knows what God originally intended when he wrote the Bible. It's been had been so distorted over time that the word of the apostles had petered out, that no one really knew the answers to these questions. And therefore, live and let live. So that was Roger Williams. So he's now standing there in Prospect Street with his arms out there over the whole thing, with his remains actually in a steel casket, hidden away like in a pharaoh's pyramid somewhere, where they have a secret, hidden in the base of that statue of Roger Williams' presumed remains. And when one of his descendants passed away, Betsy Williams, I think 1871 or something like that, in her will, 1872, that this park was going to go to Providence, and with the rule that they have no slaughterhouses on the property. I haven't been into there. And the other one was that they make a statue of Roger Williams. And so then we have the slate rock down there by the river. If you go down to, not hard to find. It's enclosed by Power Street, Gano Street, Roger Street, and William Street. That stone you see sitting in there is what's left of the rock that Roger Williams was standing in, and so forth. And the Narragansett themselves, they continued on the reservation until the late 1880s, when it was bought out by the state. And those who lived here in the city, they went to places like the Pond Street Baptist Church and others. They had their neighborhoods where they lived. But then as time goes by, as time went by into the 20th century, some of this land was recovered by the Narragansett. In the 1970s, they had federal recognition. And they acquired some of the property of the original reservation that became Bennegrett property down there in Charlestown. And in a more abstract sense, with NAGPRA, for example, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, is that it? Okay. Nancy Garcia Brown is the person who enforces that in Rhode Island. Meant that certain kinds of property could be recovered. Particularly grave goods and objects that were associated with sacred places and so forth. But according to federal law now, the Native Americans have the right to recover those kinds of objects. So some of these things that were taken away over time have been given back to societies. But anyway, I sort of see this burning of Providence not as if it's leading to utopia by any means, but it was definitely a turning point whereby Roger Williams kind of reached his own apotheosis, and the Native Americans here gradually began to reclaim, after a long period of subjugation and humiliation, finally began to reclaim some of what it was that they originally possessed. So that's the story. Yes, Toby.
I have a question about Roger Williams in comparison to all of his contemporaries, non-Native American contemporaries in New England. Was he the most well-regarded versus all his contemporaries as far as the Native Americans are concerned? Was he held in the highest esteem of anyone non-Native American?
That's a really good question. I would put at least one other at that level. And there are others who are probably not known what their relationship was exactly. So that's probably not an answer. But I think that Thomas Mayhew, the missionary of Martha's Vineyard, would be one. He's a totally different type of Christian. He believed that Native Americans could be converted and that he should provide them with the resources to be able to do that. And so he tutored them and did all kinds of things. But basically was responsible for converting pretty much the entire Wampanoag population of Martha's Vineyard to Protestant Christianity. And he was held in within that community, he was held in very high esteem. And then there was another Reverend Bourne in the Mashpee community on Cape Cod that had a reputation like that. But it was from the point of view of having succeeded as a missionary and a sort of a father of the community in that sense. But I don't think that in Massachusetts Bay Colony, I can't think of anyone that.
So in terms of meeting the Native Americans on their own terms, he was probably out there in front of everyone else.
Yeah. Connecticut, I can't think of anyone in Connecticut. Nancy, what do you think?
I think I would have a different perspective. I would say that Samuel Gorton.
Sorry?
Samuel Gorton.
Oh, Samuel Gorton.
Samuel Gorton, to me, after all of the readings that I've read, was the only true champion of Indian justice. Trust the Gorton fishermen. I mean, that came from the fact that he was the only white man you could trust in not indenturing you. He let the men live on boats, almost like boat people, and he let the women live with him as indentured, but they were still able to see their spouses. So in a sense, he was one of the very first people that didn't practice absolute slavery, in the sense of the people who were indentured were now forced to pray to who they had to pray to, marry who they were around. And Gorton was persecuted for the fact that he didn't have those rules with the native people.
And he was the one that gave my Aunt Naomi his suit of armor. Yes.
So I think
Samuel Gorton.
Gorton had a different view than most of the Christian people of his time. I think for him, he really meant what the Christian doctrine said, and he practiced it.
Yeah. He was an outsider among outsiders.
He was considered a heretic because he rebuked the fact of the Jewish code.
Very good. Yes.
Well, I have to confess, I've lived in Rhode Island 45 years, but I was born in Maryland, and I come to Rhode Island to do African studies. So I have some other perspectives, because when I first came to learn about Roger Williams, I was impressed by the stories and mythology, as you've been telling. But then I learned, of course, about the Pequot War, which was 40 years earlier, which was a brutal massacre, really, for all kinds of complicated economic reasons and so forth. And we had really a world war, not just of native people, but of Dutch and English and French and so forth. And out of the results of the Pequot War, another important part of Rhode Island history was introduced, namely slavery. And the first slaves were exported from Rhode Island, Pequots, and then in the 1675-76 war, to pay for the militias, slaves were sold to Bermuda and Bahamas, where I've been to St. David's in Bahamas to find descendants of Rhode Islanders down there. And so in the torque of telling the story of Roger Williams, we find these really glorious traditions, separation of church and state, which is a really critical part of our pedigree. But we do find also buried in the history, we find the roots of slavery, export slavery before it even was import slavery. And we do find genocide, and his affiliation with the Narragansetts was because the principle of divide and rule could be applied effectively in crushing the Pequots. And then when the Narragansetts had their own resistance, they were also destroyed.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the very early and effective strategies. Cool.
I was going to add
Yes.
one of my.
Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the context of that letter, Bill. Where was it written to somebody? The passage that you read us, what's the source? Where is it from? Was it written to a specific person, or is it part of an account?
It was a letter, okay. It's a copy of a letter with his name on it and the date on it, sent to his brother in Newport. But it's not in his handwriting. It was offered to the Rhode Island Historical Society, I think in 1956 or something like that, and they paid $800, $900 for it. But they had a whole bunch of experts look at it, and they found there was a certain watermark that would date it back to that time period. And there were things about it that appeared to be authentic, but the editors of Roger Williams' collection of letters, they also included that letter in the collection. But they said that there were also some things there that didn't seem like they could be true. And so for that reason, they said there's some doubt about whether Roger Williams wrote it. And one of the things that they used it as an example, well, I won't go into that, but I think that the reasons why they were hesitant weren't really persuasive. I think that this is I think it was, in those days people made copies because they didn't, you can't see things, you made copies. And if somebody did this, they made a few mistakes, and like for example, Arthur Fenner mentioned in the letter, there's another account of who was present at the time, and it didn't include his name. And they said, well, his name wasn't there in this other. So there are little things like that that are missing, and who knows what that means. But it is so accurate otherwise in so many other things that it's hard to, and the paper itself seems to be of the time. It's hard to believe that it's not original. It came from somebody in Tennessee who found it in their attic.
And did they have a Rhode Island connection?
I don't know. They didn't have any idea how they even had it, why they had it. Just found it in their attic.
Can you explain the phrase "what cheer" being used? It's such a coincidence. How do you explain that?
What cheer? It's conventional English greeting. Yeah, it's sort of like, are you doing okay?
Yeah.
Right. But why was it Indians were used? Because they learned.
It had become conventional.
Okay. Okay.
One of the things about the years that these two cultures interacted was that hybrid languages a hybrid language was to some degree developed. And there were words in Indian and the words in English that get used back and forth. And so this meetop was the one that was the word for friend in Narragansett. And what year was the one that was used for, for the English reading? So that's just an example of a convention there that was worked out that had both vocabularies.
Valentine Whitman owned the land upon which our house is located on Benefit Street. And he ended up moving to, he built a stone ender house up in Lincoln, which still exists. And there's a fascinating Rhode Island Supreme Court decision called In Re Narragansett Indians, in which the court had to decide, I think this is the end of the 19th century, maybe it's the beginning of the 20th, as to whether the Narragansett tribe was still in effect a tribe given, the dispersal of and in which this Rhode Island Supreme Court declared that the Narragansett tribe was not a tribe. And I've never seen any research done on this case as to, how inaccurate or accurate the decision was and its long-term impact. But it had to do with the sale of Narragansett land, because there was this Federal Non-Intercourse Act that got passed after the American Revolution, which basically said the native tribes could not transfer their land without federal approval.
That's right.
To protect them from the depredations of Governor Clinton of New York and others. But it was fairly routinely ignored by various states.
Yes, that's right.
But it's still
It's on those grounds that they recovered it. Plus the fact that the church and some of their actual religious practices were unchanged. The church had been basically the center of community for decades, back into the 18th century, following the Great Awakening. Right.
So, Bill, this was an interesting question because what our problem in this country is we don't know our history. So white folks have been snatching Native Americans and taking them to Europe for 200 years before Roger ever showed up here. And Squantum, who's my favorite colonial person, of course greets the Pilgrims because he knows how to speak the language because he'd been a slave in Europe. And anyway, what I'm raising with you is Roger gets to be what he is because of the coming of the Italians and the Irish. And we need an Anglo-Saxon. And I'm watching now as we're making Lovecraft into somebody, a horrible man. And we're making him into something because we need tourism. So anyway, I just want to share that with you, that this stuff is not just history, it's politics and history. And final comment, because I think you said it, I love Roger Williams. I think he's one of the most fascinating people ever born. But he is also a little evil, whereas most of the other folks were 100% evil. It's like, he's only 33%. And I think it's very hard. It's a complex society, and remember, you were nice. They were going to kill him in Massachusetts. This man wasn't coming down here for a spring vacation. He's coming down here to live, to survive. So this is a really nasty story, and the end of it, and I'll be quiet. I've watched the treatment of the Narragansetts all the way up to the gambler. And every chance I get, I say Rhode Island should be ashamed of itself. You basically try to annihilate a people, and then you take away every single right you can. Chafee ought to be the late senator. And then, and there's no end to it, right? So, again, excuse me for being so whatever, but this is horrible American history in our midst, and we haven't learned yet.
I wonder if we ever will.
Can I interject something?
I don't know.
Burning in that battle that you were describing. And I wondered if the Narragansetts had a tradition of trophy taking from the body parts of their enemy, and if you know anything about whether that was that kind of action was being taken.
They did that. They're stealth. The English took heads. They took heads.
And did that happen here in Providence too?
Oh, yeah.
King Philip?
Oh, yeah.
Philip's head was exhibited on a pole in Plymouth years afterwards.
For 50 years.
I wasn't making a judgment about it.
No.
I just didn't know.
I just read it, in preparation for this talk, I read a little piece on scalping, but I forget exactly what the context was. Yes?
I had actually found they had a bicentennial of the burning of Providence in the 1800s. And so they actually addressed, the Rhode Island Historical Society actually addressed, the citizens of Providence. And so I actually had copied, the beginning of it, because I still think it's pertinent today. So if you would allow me to take the time to read it, if that's okay with you, Bill.
The whole thing?
No, just the beginning.
Oh, okay.
It was just a little bit of it.
Please stand up so we can hear you.
Okay. It starts off with an address, and the address is the bicentennial of the burning of Providence in 1676. And so they go on to, address what they feel has happened in time. So when they start the address off, it says, "They seem like milestones reminding travelers on the journey of life to look back on the past for instruction and forward to the future for improvement. 2 centuries ago this day, our forefathers beheld the heavens reddened by the blaze of their dwellings, kindled by the natives who had been their friends. Our forefathers, their joys and their sorrows have passed away. It remains for us to trace out and record the history of their lives, to profit by avoiding their errors, by copying their virtues. The question is now vividly brought up. What were the wrongs that converted the once friendly Indians, who were so hospitable, and who received and protected the founder and early settlers of Rhode Island, into hostile foes? This bicentennial celebration is a fit time and an occasion to investigate this question, which involves most important principles for human government. The morals, as in a machine, every reaction is preceded by inaction. What was the action, what were the wrongs that brought about the hostility of the Indians to the settlers of Rhode Island? The burning of Providence in the war that finally swept away a once powerful people from the shores of Narragansett Bay, the name of which will forever remain a memorial of their existence. In tracing out these causes, we have to look at our early history, which is very dire. And that was the beginning of the address. And when you look at the towns, and in one of these books it tells just how many houses were left. It starts off by saying how many houses were left in each town. And they mention, in Narragansett, not one house left standing. At Warwick, but one. At Providence, not above 3. At Patuxent, none left. Very few at Seacock. At Swansea, 2 at most. Marlborough, which laid in ashes. Gatham and Nashaway, all ruined, but one house or 2. Many houses burnt at Springfield, Situate, Lancaster, Brookfield, and the New Hamptons. And I think what has not been revealed as to why the retaliation was so severe in what is called King Philip's War, which is another atrocity, the name itself. In actuality, it shouldn't even be named King Philip's War, because the real Indian prince of New England that they had any concern with whatsoever was not Massasoit at all. Massasoit could possibly raise 300 warriors, whereas Mayantonomo could raise maybe 10,000 warriors, had allegiances with people from all the way from Vermont to upstate New York in the Six Nations. And so one of the Hopkins, I believe Stephen Hopkins, mentions the only native prince we ever had any concern with in New England was Mayantonomo. And in saying that, the war, King Philip's War, was really a war to exterminate Mayantonomo for his property, his royal Warwick property, which was the prime real estate of Rhode Island. It was for the power for a man who actually was like a president. And Roger Williams literally patents our government after the strong government that the Narragansett people had. What hasn't been defined is the fact that they're a sachendom, and within that sachendom there were chieftainships, alliances, many different structures that have not been explored. But I think that the main thing that has not been recovered as to why the hostility was so severe, why the Indians returned with such anger and hatred, is because they haven't told what precipitated that. What precipitated that was Miles Standish calling all of the local sachems to Boston to sign a treaty. And hundreds of different sachems came to Boston to sign this treaty of peace and to make themselves subject of England. When they got there, the colonial militia surrounded them and stabbed them all to death. Only 2 did not attend. Massasoit couldn't get over the Taunton River, which was swollen. That's where he happened to be at the time. In Canonicus, the chief, the Mayantonomo, who would be like the president of all the local New England tribes, he had the most power. He sent them a message. The message was a rattlesnake bundle with arrows in it. The colonists sent him back a reply, which was that same rattlesnake filled with bullets and shot, gunpowder. So they tell how aggressive and how savage-like the native people were in their retaliation of the burning of all these towns, because, you know, New England was smoldering at one point. But they didn't tell us why. And that why was these sachems who came to sign a treaty of peace. And many Rhode Island historians have coined this as one of the worst atrocities in human civilization ever in the world. For all these people to come and sign a treaty, can't get it out today, a peace treaty, and to come to sign to be of peace, and then for them to exterminate them all in such a horrible manner. That's the part we didn't hear. So it's like the teacher, when the teacher looks up and sees you slap the guy in back here. She didn't see he's been kicking you all afternoon. So in a sense, that's what we have seen in the burnings of the different locations that you've seen the retaliation in King Philip's War. I also agree that Roger Williams played an important part. I think for his time, he was the best that someone of his time period, because you have to understand the racial climate of the time, what people are used to doing. So for his time period, he was wonderful for his time period. But in saying that, his Christianity was his downfall as well, because he was persecuted religiously. He there again almost did the same thing to the native people. He was their friend until he realized he could not convert them to Christianity. Unlike Gorton, who said, I don't care who you pray to as long as you bring me 60 pounds of fish a day. You can live on the water, you can come visit your wife, I just need that 60 pounds of fish, which made him a richer person. But it also fit in with the guise of his Christianity. So that's why I said I thought of all of the Christian colonists who came here, the only one who practiced what he really preached was Samuel Gorton. So with that, I thank you, Bill.
Okay, well, thanks for the Gorton mention. That was interesting.